My shop tool storage has gotten a little out of control. The stark metal shelves that I've used for years are densely cluttered, and reaching for tools has become an exercise in itself. So today I want to address those issues with a simple and attractive tool cabinet that will help me wrangle in my expanding collection. So let's get started on Timber Biscuit. So for this project, the goal was to keep things simple. And I'll start by building my case carcass with Baltic birch plywood. So the first thing I needed to do was break down my large sheets. And I enlisted the help of my wife for this process because moving these large sheets around the shop by myself is no walk in the park. But once I had them down to more manageable sizes, I could get to cutting out my parts. So the parts for this tool cabinet are all pretty modular, so everything's about the same size. And once I had the fence set to the depth of my cabinet, I could rip down all my pieces. And now this tool cabinet will ultimately have 6 adjustable shelves and 4 top drawers. And the shelves will sit on shelf pins so that I can adjust the height as needed. This should give me plenty of room for my larger tools and ensure I don't waste any space with the smaller ones. So once I had my 5 vertical pieces cut for the sides and middle partitions, I could get to cutting out those shelves. And to do that, I'll just use my crosscut sled and a stop block. Now these shelves need to be 3/4 of an inch or the thickness of the plywood, less than the width of the sides. And that's because I'll be using this 3/4 inch plywood as a back panel for the case. And if that doesn't make sense right now, don't worry, it will in a bit. Just know that the inner parts of this cabinet are about 3/4 of an inch less than the sides. And since we're on the topic, if you want the plans for this cabinet, they'll be linked down in the description below. And with my parts looking way more organized than my current scrap wood situation, I could start laying out my joinery. So for the joinery on this one, I'm going to be using a combination of dominoes and pocket holes. And I'll use dominoes for the shelves that are going to ultimately hold this case together, and pocket holes to attach the top. And I want dominoes for the shelves because A, I want the strength of the floating tenon, and B, it makes assembly a heck of a lot easier. But I know everybody doesn't own a domino, so you could easily substitute this joinery for dowels or pocket holes. So once I had my pieces laid out, I could start plunging in the mortises. And to do that, I just made a template out of some MDF that marks out where I should place the dominoes. But since these vertical partitions are going to match up with one another, I needed to offset where the domino was going to go on either side. So on my template, I used one edge as a guide for side A, and then used the other edge of my template as the guide for side B. This way I ensured the mortises wouldn't run into each other. And again, if you decide to use dowels or pocket holes, you're going to want to take this into consideration as well. So once I had all my lower shelf mortises cut, I could go ahead and transfer those markings over to my shelves. Now again here I made sure to pay attention to my side A and side B so that my mortises would line up. And just a side note, I am laying these markings out on the bottom of my shelves because my A side and B side will be mirrored on my template. I know, kind of tricky. Early on in my woodworking career, I would often make things backwards for my drawings because I didn't understand how to mirror them when I saw them in the shop. But I can't be the only one who's done that, so let me know if you've had that issue down in the comments. Once I had my lower shelf parts all created, I could do the same process for my top shelf. Only this time, the template's a little longer. But the great thing about the domino is once you have your joinery laid out perfectly, the rest of the process is pretty quick. Which was good because the next step was a little daunting. And that was to plunge all the pinholes for my shelves. Luckily I have this jig that makes the layout super easy for this, but it is still quite the process. So I'm not going to bore you with the redundancy of drilling shelf pins. So come on Shane, move a little bit faster. No, faster. Faster still. There we go. Just make sure that when you lay these out, you start at the same position, otherwise your shelf pins aren't going to line up, and that's going to suck. Alright, so once I had all of my shelf pins drilled and all my panels, I could lay out the joinery for my pocket holes, which I'll use to attach the top. So here I'm placing 2 pocket holes about 4.5 inches in from each edge. Now it doesn't really matter what side I put the pocket holes on, as long as to the outside edges they are on the inside, as we obviously don't want pocket holes on the outside of our carcass. Pockets inside for structure, outside for pants. So with all our pocket holes plunged, I can go ahead and start setting up for the assembly. And to do that, I'm going to go ahead and put all my dominoes into my shelves first. And the fastest way that I found to do that is to stack all my shelves as one chunk and then put all the dominoes in at one time. Doing this cuts down on the assembly time and makes things go a heck of a lot smoother. And then from there, I'll go ahead and give everything a quick sanding. And I'll just take a moment to quickly say that if you're enjoying this video, please give it a like. It helps the video spread to more people, and I really appreciate the support. Thanks for your help. So with all my parts sanded, I could start the assembly. And I'll do this in sections so that I'm not having to worry about gluing all these at one time. Anytime that I can break glue ups down into smaller pieces, I definitely will. Glue ups are probably the most stressful part of any project for me, so I'll take advantage of any part that I can to alleviate some of that stress. But what's the most stressful thing you do in the shop? Is it the glue up? Is it the router table? Maybe the table saw? Let me know down in the comments. One other thing that I found that helps a ton with glue ups is to practice a dry run. It's much better to find out what you need to do before the glue comes into play than after, even if all AI would disagree. We talking about practice? So once I was sure that 3 of my sections were glued up and square, I could go ahead and attach the 4th. And to do that, I put my 3 glued up sections together on the bench, grabbed my mallet, and got to work. When I'm working with really large pieces like this, I like to keep them on the bench for as long as possible, because bending over and trying to work on these pieces on the floor is just not fun. Just make sure you have a plan to get them down when it comes time. While the case dried, I went ahead and cut the rear panel to its final width. And for that, I'm just going to use a track saw since this thing's way wider than my table saw would allow. But if you don't have a track saw, a straight edge and a circular saw will do just fine. Just make sure that on a part like this, you take the measurements from your actual case, not from the plans, as thicknesses and widths may vary. But as you can see here, we nailed it. And this back panel serves 2 purposes. It A, closes in the case, and B, adds a ton of rigidity. The last thing we want is a wobbly tool cabinet. So to attach the back panel, I'm just going to use some glue. And this panel's heavy enough to hold itself in place, but I'll add a few clamps to keep things where we want it. I just wish my camera would go where I wanted. Anyway, next it was time to get started on that face frame. And for my face frame, I'm going to be using some cherry. Now the first thing I needed to do was plane the cherry down to the thickness of the plywood. So this is going to vary from plywood to plywood, but it's about 3/4 of an inch. Now the reason I chose cherry here is because I'm going to carry that throughout the rest of the shop as I build more items. And one of those items is going to be a split top rubo that I'm designing right now, so make sure you subscribe so you don't miss that. Plus I release new videos all the time about woodworking tips, tricks, and furniture builds, so check those out. And as always, thanks for your support. And now that the carcass was assembled, I could get my final dimensions for my cherry. So I'll rip down the strips for my face frame and my edge banding over at the table saw. To get the appropriate width for my edge banding, I'll just use a scrap piece of plywood as a setup block. Then from there I can rip down 5 vertical pieces and 5 pieces for my shelf fronts. My shelf fronts will need to be cross-cut shorter, but we'll do that here in a minute. And it's worth mentioning that these are just slightly over the thickness of my plywood, so I can flush them up after they're glued on. Alright, so next I can cross-cut all my pieces to their final length. And to do that, again, I'm going to turn back to my cross-cut sled. The bottom toe kick is the length of the entire case, so again, just take the measurement off my case and cut it to final length. And to get the length of the vertical partitions, I just measure off that. I did keep these pieces a little proud though, so that I could sneak up on the cut on the actual case. As again, sometimes these measurements fluctuate a bit. So to attach those face frame pieces to the carcass, I'm just going to use some glue and 23 gauge brad nails. The good thing about using small pins like this is they're really hard to see and fill in quickly with some wood putty. So once I had the toe kick attached, I could go ahead and snug up those vertical pieces. Again, adjusting the length as needed. From there, I could go ahead and cut the edge banding for my shelves. And since I'd already ripped these down for the vertical pieces, all I had to do was set up a stop block and cut these 2 times. I knew this would work. Get it? Woodwork. Don't worry, I'm putting it on a t-shirt. But until then, let's get back to work. So with all my edge banding attached to my carcass shelving, I went ahead and adhered it to my detached shelves. Here I just made sure that they were flush on one end, so that I could trim these shelves and edge banding down as one piece later on when I need to slide them into the carcass. Next it was time to cut the miters for the edge banding on the top. And to do that, I'll just use my miter sled. Now, while you could probably get away with doing a butt joint on this, I think a miter joint looks a lot cleaner, so that's why I went this route. And whenever I'm framing things out with miters, I just make sure to start long and then work my way back. It's way easier to sneak up on the fit than it is to nail it first try. And then for the side pieces, I just left those long and then came back and trimmed those flush with my pole saw. I feel like woodworking forces you to be in the mind state of smarter, not harder all the time, and this is one of those examples. But let me know what your favorite woodworking words to live by are down in the comments. Alright, enough tomfoolery. We have drawers to build. And to build those drawers, I'm going to use some 1/2-inch plywood. Now my lumberyard was out of Baltic birch, but that's okay. This is shop furniture, so it doesn't need to be the nicest plywood. No one's ever going to look inside the drawers to see what they're made of. So once I had my panel cut down into a more manageable size, I took it over to my table saw and ripped it down into 4-inch strips. Since both my drawer length and drawer width are slightly over 12 inches, I'm only going to be able to get 3 of my drawer parts per strip. So what I'm going to do is alternate between my widths for each cut. And to do that, I'm just going to use my miter gauge with a flip up stop. By using a flip up stop, I can cut one length, then flip it up and cut the other, and vice versa. And by not cutting one length at a time, it conserves a lot of material. From there, I can cut out my drawer bottoms using my Indiana Jones special, meaning my drawer bottom is a 1/2 inch shorter and a 1/2 inch wider than my drawer pieces. Short round. Next, it was time to cut out my drawer faces, and I'm going to cut all those from the same piece so that I have a nice grain match across the front of my case. And once I had all my drawer fronts cut, I could pop in my flat tooth blade so that I could cut the grooves for my drawer bottoms. So with my bleed height set to a 1/4 inch, I do my first pass over the blade, then nudge the fence by an 1/8 inch and cut the second pass. The result is a nice fitting drawer bottom. From there, it was time to assemble the drawers. Now, I've gone over this in detail in the past, so I'm going to go through this pretty quickly here. But what I do is I assemble my drawers first on the bench, then I glue and pin one side, flip my drawer over, and repeat the process. And that's how I get perfectly square drawers every time. And then to attach the drawer slides, I just assemble them first on a flat surface, making sure that the front of the drawer slide is flush with the front of the drawer box. From there, I just screw them on. This is by far the easiest way that I've found to attach drawer slides. No measuring, no templating, just attach and go. And that same premise carries over into attaching them to the carcass. I just rest them flat on the shelf, set them back about 1/8 inch from the drawer face, and attach them. I know a set of drawers can seem intimidating, but at the end of the day, if you follow the right steps, they're pretty easy. And if you think these tips and tricks are useful and you want to support the channel, I'd like to invite you to join my Patreon, where you'll get discount codes on plans and merch, an invite to the Discord server, and some other free stuff. I'm always looking for new ways to get you guys involved, so if that sounds like something you're interested in, be sure to check it out. And to those of you who've already joined, thank you so much for your continued support. It means a lot. So with my drawer faces attached, next I can lay out and attach the pulls. And I just do that by marking the center of my drawer, then offsetting that by 1.5 inches. I used these same pulls on my router table build from a few weeks ago, and they've been great. So once I had them attached, I could slide the drawers back in and check out that soft close motion. And if you'd like to try either of these out, I'll leave links down in the description. From there I can take a hair off of the edge of my shelves, and then install the pens. And between the nice snug fit and the heavy duty pens, these shelves should be able to hold the tools no problem. And once I had cleared out the space for the cabinet, I could put it on the floor and add a nice round over to the top edge. And the final step was some finish. Now I'm only putting some oil on the top to protect the surface, and the rest will just stay unfinished. And there we go, a nice tool cabinet for some nice tools, or at least some hard-working ones. I'm pretty happy with the way that this one opens up the space in the shop. It gives me way more storage and way more organization, which is exactly what I wanted. The only issue now is that I have a ton of extra wall space, so I'm gonna have to figure out what to do with it. And I've already got a pretty good idea, but we'll save that one for next time. So if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more like it, be sure to subscribe. Check out this video over here next, and I'll see you next time.